Second.
Executive session. So let's move on with the agenda. Workforce update.
Okay.
Yeah,
You need to have a vote coming out of executive
that's
session.
right. All in favor? Aye. Thanks for keeping me honest.
The actual items, sir.
Yes.
The, not coming out of executive session, but the items we discussed in executive session. I think there needs to be a vote on.
Whether to move forward. Right. With the staff's recommendation. Do I hear a motion?
Move for approval.
Do I hear a second? Moved and properly seconded that we move forward with staff's recommendations. Thank you. Next item. Oh, vote. All in favor? Aye. It's not a good day. Maybe it's the hair.
It's almost the weekend, man.
Yes. Next item on the agenda.
Okay, next item, City of Charleston preliminary pay plan results and workforce update. And I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Landry, who is there with you. All right, Ryan, it's all yours.
Okay. Morning, Mayor, Council. Today we have for you for the HR Committee our workforce update and preliminary compensation survey results. If I can. All right. So to get us started, we just have a sort of brief update on our demographics. So we have just the race and ethnicity breakdown for our non-sworn fire and police staff, gender breakdown for the same, education level. These are all versions of stats you may have seen previously, but we have two new ones we wanted to share with you today, which is the employees residing in city limits. We know this has been a topic that's come up, so we ran some data to see where we sort of fall with that. Our non-sworn staff, approximately 30% of those employees reside actually within city limits. For the fire department, it's approximately 33%. For police, it's approximately 41%, for a total of about 35% of city employees actually residing in city limits. We also have another new stat, employee replacement rate, which is really just how many we hire versus how many leave. For non-sworn year to date, we have hired 82 employees. 89 have separated. For fire, we've hired 27, lost 17. For police, we've hired 15 and lost 16. For a total of 124 new hires, 122 separations, for a net gain of 2 employees so far this year.
I just had a question on the employees residing in the city limits. So if they're in, say, the James Island PSD or the St. Andrews PSD, they're not in the city as well. Is that correct? We don't have any idea on how many of those live in West Ashley or James Island but are not in the city limits, do we?
Correct. No, we GIS data, they keep a list of actual city addresses. That was how we ran our comparison. So we really just know how many people are not in the city.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor.
I think I'm seeing this right. In the fire department itself, we have net gain 10 employees.
That's correct. And the fire department tends to hire in a big group because they run big classes. So they've hired a major class this year, which is why their number is so high. That will drop off over the year since we're going to go a few months before we see another class.
Thank you.
Just as a follow-up question on employees residing in city limits.
Is there?
Do we know whether or not there is any assistance that these public safety personnel have gotten that makes it affordable for them to live in the city? For example, there are first-time home buyer programs out there. There are programs that HUD funded for public safety folks, teachers, et cetera, to be able to buy. It would be interesting to see how how can they afford to do what the others can't?
Yeah,
just be a very interesting.
I'm definitely not as familiar with those programs, but we can look into that more and see what information we can find.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Moving on. So our first real chart, we have our staffing levels. So this is just our current staffing level for all of our city employees. The blue line is for the police department, the red line is for the fire department, and the white or silvery line is for our non-sworn employees. So that's everybody that's not a police officer or a firefighter. We have some of the historical data in there as well, but we're really kind of primarily focused on the last couple of years. We see fire has kind of been hovering around sort of the same amount. Mayor, to your question about the fire department, they have big classes, which is where we see big spikes in their staffing level because they bring on a large number at once. Police holds relatively stable. They had a small dip sort of right as COVID kicked off. They've started to recover their staffing levels a little bit. And then for the white line for non-sworn, the staffing level has essentially maintained a pretty downward tick since about November of 2018. And currently our non-sworn staffing is about 75%. Our fire staffing is about 95% and police is about 90%. The next chart, we have the 4-month moving average, which is just a way for us to look at the trend to see if there's any major trends. We see again, fire holding somewhat stable. Police similarly somewhat stable, a small drop in the last few months. And then again, the white line, a pretty stable downward turn for our non-sworn staffing levels. Next up, we have our annual turnover. So this is through year end 2021. We ended up with a fire turnover rate of about 8.5%, a police turnover rate of about 11%, and a non-sworn turnover rate of about 26%, which is the highest from any year that we've kind of looked at for non-sworn. Fire's turnover rate did tick up, but 2020 was a uncharacteristically low year for them, coming in at about 3%, whereas historically they kind of hover around 9 or 10. Police similarly, they've held pretty stable. They didn't really see a drop sort of through the COVID years, so they've hovered around 10. And non-sworn, we'd historically kind of stayed maybe around 15, but have had to climb up to that 26%.
Mr. Mayor,
And when you say turnover, are you counting all?
Mayor, would you turn your mic on?
When you refer to turnover, you're counting even retirements or somebody's separated for cause or any reason whatsoever?
That's correct. So that is total turnover just to account for essentially what our attrition rate really is. Right. So yeah, retirements, but we do keep that data separately. So that is something we could break out at a later point. Just not something we've included in this one.
Okay, thank you.
No. I hit too many buttons. My apologies.
No problem.
Same thing. We have the 4-month moving average for total turnover. Again, just to kind of look at the trends. Generally, we kind of see the white line non-sworn trending up fairly highly. We do see an increase for the blue and red for fire and police coming into 2021 to 2022, but their trends are holding somewhat stable. Fire's seen a small drop over the last couple of months, not enough to, I think, really build any assumptions off of, but potentially stabilizing. Non-sworn, we've seen a small drop in the trend over the last couple of months, but that is consistent with what we see every year. And perfect, thank you. And so the sort of caution there, let's see if I can get this right. No, it doesn't show up. So while we've seen a drop in that kind of white line, if you look at each year, which is separated by the black lines, there's always a small drop before we see that trend kind of go up much more aggressively as we reach sort of the summer months. So we're seeing our turnover come down a little bit on the trend, but if that spike happens, as it has in essentially every year, we're not quite sure exactly where that's going to end us at. To try to get to that assumption.
Sorry.
Is
Is
there,
there
Great.
is there a cause for that? I mean, is it summer workers, seasonal workers that are leaving?
So for turnover, we actually don't count seasonal employees.
Okay.
Because we know that they're going to be leaving coming. For turnover, we essentially are only talking about regular full-time and part-time positions. The position has been budgeted year round, essentially. So it's someone that we would expect to be sort of permanently working for us.
So have we done any looking into seeing why people are leaving?
Yeah, so I've got a few more slides on the exit surveys that we send out, and
Gotcha.
we'll be able to sort of get into that more detail as well. So to sort of look at our total turnover, what we've done on this slide is we've looked at through April of each year. So as much of an apples to apples comparison as we can. So for 2014, what was the turnover from January through April, 2015, 2016, all the way up to this year? This year, the trend numbers are definitely going up a little higher than expected. Last year, our total turnover was not great. Through April, we saw about a 7% turnover in non-sworn. So far this year, we've seen 9.5%. So we've actually lost about 10% of our non-sworn employees just through the end of last month. We also see fire and police turnover trending up slightly as well. Neither one is kind of reaching a historical high, but it's definitely going in a direction that we don't necessarily want to see, but not quite as bad.
Well, when we look at the non-sworn, it being so much higher, what's the true number of people we're talking about on non-sworn compared to outside of percentages? The true number, is it a smaller number of people?
So non-sworn is our single biggest group. So fire accounts for approximately 330 employees. Police accounts for approximately 440 employees. And non-sworn is approximately, say, 900 to 1,000 employees.
Okay, thank you.
So with the total turnover through April, we've tried to build out some predictive models, but frankly, the last 2 years have trashed them. But historically, we have seen that January through April turnover accounts for about 28% of our total turnover through the year. If that remains true for this year, fire and police turnover will hit about 13%, which is definitely trending higher, not as bad as they've seen, but worse than the last couple of years. But our non-sworn turnover, if this trend holds, will hit approximately 33%. So all to say, we don't know what the rest of the year is going to bring. Our predictive models have pretty much blown themselves to pieces over the last couple of years. But if that general trend holds, it's definitely going to be a very high rate of turnover, higher than we've ever seen. And I also just wanted to note that with this, as part of the budget for this year, we passed one of the biggest pay increases we have in recent years. We passed that pay increase, and frankly, our turnover went up. So we increased our non-sworn pay about 7%, and more people started leaving, which is a little unusual.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Your measurements are primarily over year to year, 12-month periods of time?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Your measurements, the period of time that you're measuring over, is pretty much a 12-month period of time?
So for this total turnover through April, we're actually looking at just that first 4-month period each year.
Well, I get that for 22, but I mean, when you go 18, 19, 20, 21, are those 12-month intervals?
No, so it's the same 4-month interval for each year. So we're comparing the same 4-month period of 2014 to 2015 to 2016, all the way up to 2022.
So if these measurements were made, what would it look like if you did it over 3 years, for example? What I'm trying to drill down on, we hire people, we train them, and they leave. There's a situation, if we were to look at these numbers over 3-year intervals, would it show a different statistic?
I don't think that it necessarily would. To your comment about potentially training people to leave, we do have some stats on when people are leaving beyond just how many. So I think that might speak to a little bit about sort of that trend on people. But otherwise, I think even sort of dragging the trend out on just the turnover would necessarily make a big difference. But we can show you exactly kind of when we're losing people.
Well, that'd be good. Am I jumping ahead of the presentation? Or?
Yes. So
all right, good. That's okay. I'll be quiet and listen.
So our next slide, so we have years of service at separation. So this is us looking at when are we losing those people? Because if we included every year, we'd have a lot of lines and this chart wouldn't make a lot of sense. We've consolidated it down into 5 major groups. We have 0 to 4 years, which is the gray or silver line. We have 5 to 9 years, which is the yellow. We have 10 to 14 in green, 15 to 19 in purple, 20 to 24 in blue, and 25 plus in orange. Kind of as we'd expect, the biggest groups tend to be those with the fewest years of service. The trend has remained relatively stable. So this chart is broken out essentially into 3 different sections. So it's really 3 charts crammed into one, just because I already had too many slides and didn't want to drag this on too long. But the first third is just the fire department. The middle third is just the police department. And the final third is just our non-sworn employees. So for fire, we see kind of early on 2011, 2012, they were actually losing more than 80% of their employees in the 0 to 4 years. But that number has kind of trended back down. For police, we kind of see a relatively stable trend. 2021 dropped a little bit, but the numbers went back up. For our non-sworn, we see again somewhat a stable trend over the last probably 5 or 6 years so this number is the percentage of turnover. So we're not losing 70% of our non-sworn staff, but 70% of those leaving were within their first 4 years of employment. And of that number, actually about 75% of that were people who had not finished their first year. So if you haven't quite made it 2 years, you don't tend to last terribly long with us.
I was just going to try to summarize it so I can understand it. Would it be true to say that if employees stay with the city for 10 years, they tend to stay for a career?
That's correct.
And up to 10 years, they're turning over pretty fast.
That's correct. And we also think sort of beyond that, fire and police sees lower levels of that. We think potentially because fire and police both have a pay plan, which incentivizes them where they're getting more pay increases in their first years. As you get more seasoned in your career as police or fire, the movement slows down a little bit. For non-sworn, we unfortunately don't have anything of that nature. So they come in, we frankly don't see a lot of movement. Within a year or two, they're looking for progress. And unfortunately, a lot of times that progress is somewhere else.
Dollars lost and all that kind of stuff.
So we don't have a great method for measuring that. We know there's a cost, but a lot of it tends to be almost more of an opportunity cost. It's the cost of lost time or lost progress. So I don't have an exact dollar amount, but we definitely know there is an impact. So for our next part, so we have our exit survey results. To make it somewhat of a comparison, we have 2021 as compared to 2022. So all the exit surveys we received last year versus all the exit surveys we've received so far this year. We have essentially we ask employees or leaving employees to tell us what their top reasons were. Generally, we see 2021, pay, room for growth, family circumstances were all pretty major categories. Going into 2022, we see that pays actually jumped out ahead by about 15%. Room for growth is still a major component, but not as much. Family circumstances still kind of up there. We see an increase in work environment and conditions, which is essentially around coworker or supervisory relations. And then we also see a small uptick in schedule and the commute. But in diving deeper into those results, a lot of our employees who were mentioning schedule or the commute as a reason for their leaving were either in trade positions or safety sensitive positions that required them to work set hours in a set location.
So that's more than 100%. You add up all those numbers that employees answer 2 or 3 times, or?
Correct. So they're allowed to pick multiple ones.
Yeah.
And then after they've selected those responses, we ask them to rank them. So our next slide will actually have the ranking of, okay, so if you've picked your top 3, which of those actually led you most to leaving versus which one kind of had the least impact?
Gotcha.
How many responses did you have in 2021 and then in 2022?
2021, I want to say we had, I believe, 77 or 78. So far this year, we've had 26.
Okay, so pretty. And how many? What percentage of people leaving did an exit survey?
It's a little less than half.
Okay.
So it's not as representative as we would like, but when employees are leaving, they're a little less inclined to do them. So still hitting a little over a third gives us at least a decent idea, we think.
All right.
Can we assume that the commute too long has something to do with affordability housing?
It may very well, especially going back to our first slide about percentage of employees living in the city.
Yeah.
For example, just off the top of my head, when we were reviewing the commute too long responses, one of those was somebody who lived in Ladson. We don't know their reasons for living in Ladson, but I could definitely see where that would be a problem.
Also on the commute too long, you had said something about the majority of that was people that were working set times. So I'm assuming you're saying those may be people that are in rush hour traffic back and forth both ways.
Potentially. It's also to address the schedule piece. So for example, some of our exit surveys for commute and schedule were our mechanics, but they only work two shifts essentially. And so their hours are very specific, as well as some of our more safety sensitive positions in, for example, the police department, where they have some 24-hour positions where the schedule is, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including holidays. So those positions just don't lend themselves to necessarily providing any flexibility for commute or schedule.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So I was just looking at the no room for growth is pretty consistent, and then it's ranked fairly high, especially for this year. But I think going back to Mayor Tecklenburg's point on the previous slide, if you're seeing less turnover at 10 plus years and staying for a career, it would naturally hold then that you would see the fluctuations in the lower job tenured position. If people are staying 10 plus years and going into a career, it would make sense that there would be higher turnover at 0 to 4 if we have employees that are staying longer and not turning over in those positions. So it's kind of a circular logic. I don't know that there's necessarily a way to address that, because if we start seeing higher turnover in longer tenured people and lower turnover in the shorter tenure, that's not necessarily the inverse thing that you want to happen either.
That's correct. The trend is very consistent with what we'd expect. People that are going to leave it's generally around engagement. In your first 4 years, you're going to be less engaged. You might look for other positions. And then as you stay longer, you're more engaged. You are more likely to remain here, especially with some of the city benefits and the pension that we have. There is an incentive once you've been in at a certain point to kind of keep that benefit available to you and keep working. But the trend is definitely consistent. But when you take that trend plus sort of our increase in turnover, we potentially reach a point where we're going through so many people in the 0 to 4 years that not as many people are making it longer. And as you mentioned, is there?
National trend with regard to these factors.
Other cities in the area are not terribly forthcoming with their turnover statistics. So I can't tell you exactly how it measures up. We do have some data from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics on sort of general turnover. They don't really look at tenure per se, just kind of that overall turnover number. In previous years, the average would have been about 10%. So we were a little above average before. The last couple of years, things have gotten a little wild and crazy. I can't say exactly what those numbers are off the top of my head, but I think generally a lot of industries have seen an increase in turnover over the last probably 2 years.
And then one last question on pay, because the increase came this year, right? And so we really can't get a sense of whether or not that is going to have an effect on turnover. Although I see this 62% said pay, right? That's just 4 months of this year, correct?
That is correct. However, so I also have our next slide where we asked about the rankings, which will tie into this a little bit. So after we ask what your reasons for leaving are, we ask you to rank them, essentially, which ones are most, which ones are least. The bigger takeaway from this one is essentially that pay essentially broke out a bigger lead. So we see in 2021, pay and room for growth, family circumstances are all relatively close. We're kind of within one margin of each other. But for 2022, essentially pay became such a higher ranking issue that it's now essentially kind of 2.5 margins ahead. So it's essentially a weighted method. As far as the pay impacting the turnover, to be frank, we would have expected with the pay increase that, especially looking at that kind of January through April turnover, that we might have at least plateaued. The concern is that it increased.
Wow.
So we were kind of really hoping that, okay, we'll do this pay increase, potentially get us a little closer to where we want to be, and hopefully at least essentially stem the tide. Instead, the tide kept rolling in.
That's why I raised the question. Okay, thank you. But we can't conclude necessarily that if we went up again, that this trend wouldn't continue, particularly if we're not competitive.
That is true. We do have some numbers. So this is all building up to our compensation survey.
Okay, I'll leave you alone.
So for the next section, we have some information on recruitment statistics, just to kind of show you where we're at. So we've kind of pulled the last year of our actual recruitment. So we switched to a new applicant tracking system, which is providing us a lot more data than we used to have. So we're able to see for the jobs that we post, how many people are actually viewing those jobs. And we can compare that to how many applications we received to get a number that we call a conversion rate, which is really just the percentage of people who applied for the job after looking at the job. General industry target was about 10% before the last few years. The last couple of years have brought that trend a little down. So we'd almost expect anywhere kind of between 3% or 10% would be a good number. 10% would be 1 out of every 10 people who come looking at your job decide that, yeah, I'd like to apply for this, which we think is a decent number. However, we're averaging essentially over the last year at about a 1.25% conversion rate. For the last 2 quarters, the number has gone up slightly. So for 2021, we were closer to 1. For 2022 so far, we're coming a little closer to 2%. But that still essentially means for us to get 1 applicant, 50 people have to look at that job, which is a little lower than we would necessarily like. So the big chart at the right has our bottom 10 jobs and our top 10 jobs as far as conversion rate this year, just to give you an idea of where we're attracting candidates. Bottom jobs tend to be trades positions, engineering positions, also some recreation positions. They just don't quite seem as popular as they used to, unfortunately. So kind of that number 1 bottom job, the trade specialist in the fire department, we had 891 job views and 1 person decided to apply for that job, which is not ideal. And we see that same trend through a lot of those bottom 10 positions. But on the more positive side, our top 10 jobs, we have a lot of more administrative positions. They tend to average a little over 4.5%. So we had an admin assistant in public service that actually had a conversion rate of 8%. So we had 31 people out of 390 views, which is closer to kind of what we would want to see, making sure that we've got a very robust candidate pool and that we're hiring really the best quality employees that we can. However, for the top 10 jobs, you'll see that number conversion rate drops somewhat precipitously. So we start at that almost 8%, but by the time we've reached number 10, which was our summer resilience intern, we've dropped to 4.5%. So the numbers come down relatively quickly. Where we were talking about maybe that 3 to 10% rate, had we hit a 5% conversion rate, say we had made it somewhere in the middle, we would have had approximately 3,300 more applications to review for our positions. And so far in 2022, we've made 167 job offers, but have received 18 rejections, which is not something we used to track, just because I don't think it happened quite that often, but that puts us at about an 11% rejection rate. And one last point to make, especially on those bottom jobs, where we're looking at positions where we're only getting 1 or 2 applicants, it's definitely leaving us in a position where we're kind of forced to hire that 1 person. If we only have 1 applicant, we have to find a way to make it work, which is maybe not leaving us with the exact quality we would want, though we appreciate everyone we get. We believe so. So this is all led up to our compensation survey, which for a little background, we did a very sort of abbreviated compensation survey as we were looking at the budget last year, which led us to believe that we needed to do a much more thorough one this year. So beginning in about January of this year, our team started building out this survey, identifying positions, other agencies, points of contact for us to reach out to. And we surveyed 48 different non-sworn positions, as much as we could for a representative sample of city positions, as well as all of our sworn positions across 41 different organizations, and we received 30 total responses. So we've been combining all of that data in to essentially see how we rank, how do we stack up. So this first slide is for our non-sworn positions. The chart on the left is the base result, so just purely dollar for dollar. And the percentage essentially tells you where we fell, or could be read as how many places essentially pay higher than us on average. So for our non-sworn, the base results, City of Charleston is at about 51%. So we're kind of right in the middle. About 51% of the surveyed organizations pay more than us for any given non-sworn position. Unfortunately, those ahead of us include a lot of our local area. So we have Mount Pleasant, St. Andrews, North Charleston, the water system, the school district, the housing authority, and the county, who's really technically at our same number. However, especially with a lot of the talk about cost of living, we wanted to add a cost of living factor into this. So what we did was, if you're familiar with MIT's living wage study, they update it in the first quarter of every year. So it's relatively up to date. We took that number and we compared every organization's county or metropolitan area, the base living wage for one adult, no child, and essentially matched up how those compared to give us essentially a percentage. So if the City of Charleston, if the living wage were say $1, but the living wage in somewhere else was 99 cents, we know that, okay, their pay essentially is 1% better. $1 goes a little bit further. So we built that comparison out and applied it to the wages that everyone reported to us, which gives us the chart on the right, which is including that cost of living factor, which takes us from 51st essentially to 69th in the bottom 5. And the cost of living factor is something new. We haven't quite included that in some of our comparisons before, but as we can tell, it has a frankly pretty striking and dramatic effect.
So I just have a quick question, because as I look through these, and I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, I'm familiar with how North Carolina's kind of system of government operates, and then went to high school in Virginia Beach, and I see the city of Norfolk there. But one of the things I'd be curious to see, and I know we do not have that information currently, but one is their city budgets. 2 would be eventually the percent of the budget spent on life safety, police and fire, or EMS if that's included in there. But also if they have the ability to create taxes, like do they have taxing authority? Because one of the issues that we run into year after year after year when we keep talking about the budget is that we're hemmed in what we can do. Like we can't create a new tax. The legislature does not give us that authority. And then we're even capped on the amount of property tax that we can raise in terms of the millage. So the ability to create revenue is severely restricted. And so I'd be curious to see, for these cities that we're getting compared against, do they have an easier time raising their pay because they have the ability to create additional revenue sources as a part of supplementing their budgets?
You're correct. I definitely do not have that information available today. But I do just want to point out that while we do have some organizations sort of outside of sort of our local area in South Carolina, the majority of our responses are from within the state of South Carolina and generally are other cities as well. So we try to temper some of those unknowns by keeping our focus a little central, but we can do some work on looking into some of those other cities and see there's definitely a lot of differences. We know especially some cities, they still have the water authority as part of them. Some of them have different transit groups. We have different cities with totally different enterprise setups for things like sanitation. So there are a lot of differences that could contribute.
So Ryan, I understand this is maybe the first year you try to filter in this cost of living factor, but I must just say, looking from City of Charleston and Charleston County being together over there at 51%, and then you go to the right, and Charleston County is still at 51%. We've dropped down to 69. I guess you've got different numbers for cost of living between the city and the county. And then you've got only 35% of our employees actually live in the city. So if we had an employee that lived in Hollywood, somewhere out in Charleston County, my inference would be there's not that kind of differential, or am I just reading too much into that?
No, I'll double check the Charleston County number because from what I remember, we used essentially the same number because we were using either county level or metro area to try to normalize those numbers as much as we could. So pretty much everything in our local region really shouldn't have moved that much, or at least kind of moved similarly to us.
Right.
I'll have to double check and see what happened with the county's number to where it didn't change quite as much.
Yeah. The others moved a bit. I was just like St. Andrews Public Service District went from 35 to 52. But that just seems to stand out. Maybe there's just something with the number for Charleston County.
I'll double check. The county was one of the last numbers we received. So we were kind of struggling to get them in there. I'll double check to see what would happen with that number.
All right, thank you.
Benefits package by city and how that may affect turnover?
Very preliminary ones, nothing in as much depth. But when we look at some of the compensation, one of the issues we've kind of run into, especially as we're attracting applicants, is frankly, especially if you get kind of to the lower half of our employees, they're frankly just not as interested in the benefits package. And the selling point to them is the dollar amount. What is it going to be worth to get them through the door? We've been able to make a lot of good arguments on benefits packages to our higher paid employees, or people who've, especially if you've had, say, like a major medical issue, you're probably more aware of medical insurance and its importance, and you might pay some more attention to that. So we know it plays a part, but we don't have any numbers for comparison. But it's just also something we know that our applicants aren't necessarily waiting as much as we would like them to.
Councilman Gray.
Does this include the 7% pay increase?
That's correct. This is current numbers as of today.
And you do think that the turnover in the non-sworn population as compared to the sworn has more to do with the performance-based pay in our police and fire department?
I think
because they have a better package.
the plan helps in sworn, I think, especially with keeping people longer, which is where when we were looking at that sort of years of service separation, we see they don't lose as many people in those first sort of 0 to 4 years. Pay is definitely still a concern for them, but I think it's less of an immediate concern because we have at least some built-in growth for them. But I think that's really more accounted for in that sort of where we see people leaving part. So next up, we have our sworn summary. We have it broken out by police and fire. And we'll also have some examples of their pay plans to sort of refresh everyone's memory on what those look like. But the plans are essentially built around the bachelor's degree level as kind of the midpoint. So we compared both the base level, which is your high school education, to the bachelor's degree level. We see on the police side, we're doing reasonably well. We're essentially in the top third. Fire, we're doing a little bit lower. So those are the two charts on the right-hand side. We're still doing okay. We're at least in the top half versus where we kind of compared where we were with our non-sworn, but definitely still a couple of locales that are slightly ahead of us on those. Sorry, say again?
I said in the state, well, if you compare just Charleston, North Charleston, Mount Pleasant, I mean, we're still doing much better.
Correct. Yeah, at least in our local area, we're still reasonably competitive. We actually had some issues with some of our fellow local agencies wanting to respond to the sworn part of the survey because we were already potentially poaching some of their employees and they didn't want to necessarily make that problem worse. But we still are falling behind in a couple areas. We see Greenville, Savannah are both sort of managing pretty well. Greenville is a lot smaller, so it is a little bit different for them. And then we included Atlanta and Charlotte, which we haven't always historically done, but just to sort of keep that comparison up. So seeing them at the top isn't totally a surprise, but yeah, seeing sort of Greenville and Savannah slightly ahead. But yeah, we're doing a reasonably good job keeping up in the local area. However, much like non-sworn, we factored in what we're calling our cost of living factor to sort of see where that ends up. we end up seeing a little bit of a drop kind of across the board, except for the bachelor's degree level for police officers. Their percentage drops, so it becomes more competitive, but they still at least remain roughly third out of these respondents. For the fire department, we see that they kind of drop down to slightly below medium, but at the bachelor's degree level are still at least kind of slightly ahead. For our sworn employees, we also included a number of questions about the structure of their plan. So as we were discussing, they have a somewhat more progressive pay plan. They have steps, they have incentives that keep them moving forward through their plans. I'd show you the same thing for non-sworn, but unfortunately, since we don't have one, there's really nothing there for it. But as far as the sworn plan structure, the top half on the left-hand side is the fire department. The first two columns are the average that we see from other agencies. The last two columns are for the city. So growth potential is essentially how far you can go from the bottom to the top for the rank that you're in. We'll use firefighter as an example. We see an average growth potential of about 40% with an average non-cost of living growth per year of about 5%. So a lot of agencies, if you're a firefighter, you're getting some kind of steps, maybe every year or two. It averages about 5% a year and would take you to about 40% more than your pay. For the city, we have options that get you up to 70% and potentially gives you a non-cost of living growth of up to 9%. In addition, for us, for firefighter to assistant engineer, that is a non-competitive promotion. So technically that growth potential kind of backs up to each other. And we'll have a more in-depth example of some of this as well. But generally fire has a above average growth potential. So there's more opportunities for them to grow. And we'll get to what those opportunities look like as well. For the bottom half, we have police. Police hews much more closely to average, plus or minus maybe 10%, depending on specific ranks. But their growth is about the same as the average, and their growth potential is about the same. The chart on the right is looking at essentially agency incentives. What are some of the ways that you could get to that growth potential? Some places just give you essentially step increases. You move 3, 4, 5% every year until you reach the top and you're done. We have a somewhat similar structure, but we also have an incentive aspect that is heavily based around education, to the point where every education level you have for fire and police is worth an additional 7%. So if you have a bachelor's degree, you make 14% more than somebody who has a high school diploma, just on the basis of education alone. In addition, fire has an additional 7% incentive for being a paramedic. We don't see that level of incentive among many other agencies. The closest we get is Greenville, who also provides a max incentive of 30%, but it's based on 6 different types of incentives. And there are things that, frankly, you'd be unlikely to be able to check all 6 boxes. Town of Mount Pleasant gets close with a 27% max incentive. And frankly, I think 22% of that is just being a paramedic. On average, the education incentive that we see in a lot of agencies is probably closer to 7.5 or 10%, whereas we provide potentially up to a 31% incentive, which is to say that of that 70% growth potential for a firefighter, essentially 31% of that is related to education level. So this slide is some of our current examples. So the left side is our police pay plan. The right side is our fire pay plan. And you'll see where it's based very heavily around education. Essentially, you have 5 education steps and a lot of ranks. You maybe only have 4, 5, or 6 actual steps within the rank. But then the education is worth 7%, whereas the steps, with the exception of firefighter, are worth 5%. So we've really incentivized education even more so than essentially steps in your current role, and even more so than a promotion up to the next role in a lot of cases, which tends to also only be worth 5%. So the way we've set up the plans, essentially there's a bigger incentive to get, say, an associate's or a bachelor's degree than necessarily to get a promotion. On the fire side, the colors are a little different because their plan is a little different. The The green steps, they actually get every 6 months. And the orange and blue, they get every year. Essentially what all that means is for a police officer, a newly hired police officer can reach police officer step 3, which is the last step they can achieve in about 4 years, earning an additional 22%, which is about 5.5% annually over where they started. For police officers, advancement to senior police officer is a competitive promotional process. You have to test, you have to go through the process to get there. For firefighter, you come out of the academy on step 1. After 6 months, you reach step 2. After 6 months, you reach step 3. Step 1 to step 2 is a 10% increase instead of 5, as it is throughout the rest of the plan. And then from there, you can essentially test to become an assistant engineer, but the test is learning to drive one of the engines or apparatus. There's no other requirement. It's a non-competitive process. Theoretically, every single one of our firefighters could become an assistant engineer. And then each subsequent assistant engineer step takes about a year. So where we saw that the firefighters across the department had this 70% kind of growth potential, this is part of why. So their plan has been structured to move a little bit quicker, especially starting out, and gives them some more incentives to move along a little faster, especially at those lower ranks with that non-competitive promotion.
Just a general question about the steps. The steps are performance-based or tenure-based?
So the green and blue steps are more tenure-based. The orange steps are a little bit more performance-based, but they're almost more achievement-based.
Okay.
So for example, like assistant engineer, the orange steps, one of the achievements would be learning to drive a new type of vehicle. And I think potentially, and don't quote me on this, maybe 20 hours of additional training. For a senior police officer to go from step 2 to step 3, they actually have to wait 2 years and have to complete some number of training or special assignments or some additional achievements to qualify for that next step. So we have a mix of both pure sort of tenure based as well as a little bit more achievement based.
And this is not applicable to non-sworn.
Correct.
Yeah,
this is just police and fire. Non-sworn has frankly nothing like this.
And if we had such a process for non-sworn, do you think that our numbers in terms of retention would be different?
I do, especially as we look at that trend of when people are leaving, and we see that non-sworn has a trend almost 20% higher for that 0 to 4 years. If we had more incentive to keep people, if you had an incentive to stay, if you saw that growth or advancement, even in your same position, that does provide you an incentive to stay, or at the very least provides you an incentive not to look.
And is it cost effective in terms of the turnover, training that has to be done, et cetera, to move to a performance-based or step-based system?
I would argue yes. There's a lot of logistics around building a sort of step-based plan that really works in a way that's meaningful. We see a lot of organizations that have step-based plans where either it just sort of becomes de facto or it becomes sort of too complicated to use. So there would be some work in setting up such a plan, but there definitely would be value to one. It's something that we have talked about looking into bringing proposals forward in the next few years. But frankly, at this point, as we'll see from the survey, especially where our starting pay is at in general is probably our bigger concern versus really having that step-based plan. Ideally, we would love to have that kind of plan because we think it would definitely incentivize people. It allows us to keep that institutional knowledge of people versus having departments where you're losing, we have some departments that lose approximately 30% of people a year. So if you're just going through that many people, you're really reducing the number left who have that knowledge that you really can apply out in the field.
Mr. Mayor?
This gets off the subject a little bit, but just because we've all seen some comparisons to hourly wage, this is all an annual. Could you try to just briefly explain the difference with the sworn pay plan and the hourly structure versus our non-sworn employees?
Sure. So really, both our police, fire, and a lot of our non-sworn employees are essentially just hourly. Until you reach really a certain level where you become more salaried or an exempt employee as far as the Federal Labor Standards Act goes. That's the real sort of dividing line. Police and fire have some other rules around it. They reach overtime at different levels, things of that nature. But essentially for a lot of our non-sworn employee, they work your standard 40-hour shift and their hourly rate is based on that. Police, their hourly rate is based on a similar setup, essentially 2,080 hours a year, 40-hour week. That's what their salary is based on. For our firefighters, they work a slightly different schedule because they work 24 hours on and essentially 48 hours off. So they're working a full day with 2 days off, assuming full staffing. So for their pay, their hourly rates do appear to be a little lower, but essentially we're paying them that hourly rate for the full 24 hours that they're on shift. So no matter what they're doing, if you are on shift, you're receiving your full hourly rate. Due to the nature of our schedules, the 24 hours on, 48 off, I forget the exact interval, but essentially every couple pay periods, you have built-in overtime because the overtime trigger hits in a way that if you work, say, 3 shifts that week, you are guaranteed to make some amount of overtime from that. So their schedule is a little differently, works a little different. Their hourly rates do appear to be a little bit lower, but it's essentially because we're paying for that full 24-hour shift, again, sort of regardless of what's going on that shift. So, I mean, especially even fire, if they're lucky enough to have some sleep time, you still receive the same amount because you might receive a call at any point. So that hourly rate remains consistent, except for the built-in overtime where you would actually get a slightly higher hourly rate. And when we do the annual estimate for them, we try to paint that picture of what it would look like if you worked all of your shifts to try to give you as close of an estimate as possible of kind of what you could expect from a year. So these numbers for fire and same for police assumes that you work every shift that you're scheduled for.
So at the end of the year, the effect is they work more hours than overtime on some of them.
That's correct.
I got
you. Brian, for just the regular firefighter level, we've got 4 steps here. Do we lose firefighters after they get to that 4th step that may not want to become or may not want to get that engineer position? I guess I'm asking, should there be more steps there? It's kind of my question.
I don't have that data available, but we would generally expect that we probably might see some of that. However, as of I think about maybe 4 or 5 years ago, the firefighter pay plan actually did have greater steps at that base level. But the fire administration at the time actually switched that around and wanted to very pointedly sort of incentivize more people moving to assistant engineer because we wanted more drivers. And so we have tried having more steps, and they had kind of very pointedly moved away from having that to kind of incentivize this. I think it's definitely something we'd love to look into more and see if there's a potential option for restructuring.
I'd be interested in that. I mean, there may be a guy that's just interested in being a firefighter and not interested in taking that next step, assistant engineer. And if we're cutting off there, does he go somewhere else? I guess, I guess it's kind of my
absolutely.
My
and that kind of ties into, I think, our kind of conversation about having more of a step-based plan in general, not just for police and fire, but also for our non-sworn. Because there's a distinct chance that we have a lot of people who are very good at the one thing they're doing, don't really want to be anything different than that. And we're not necessarily incentivizing them terribly well to stay. Fire, you get a little bit more, but essentially you get kind of 2.5, 3 years of growth. And at that point, the only growth you would see after that is the cost of living increases.
Talking about COLA, will COLA affect the sworn as it does the non-sworn?
Yeah, and so we do have a recommendation that in previous years, we've kind of done pay adjustments and COLAs rolled into one. One of our recommendations is going to be to split that out and pass a true cost of living increase based on some defined measure like CPI or some other index. And we would take the cost of living increase and recommend essentially applying that to every employee. So if we say cost of living in the city of Charleston has gone up 3%, every employee, every pay plan receives a 3%. And if we need to make other adjustments, then we kind of do it after that.
But then police and fire, okay, would get the COLA plus what they would normally get through their staff.
That's correct.
Okay. The second thing is, wow, that's a lot. Steps are really not based on performance. What I mean by that, satisfactory, excellent, outstanding. Because as I've been exposed to on a performance-based step system, if you're marginal, no. I don't care if you've been at 10 years. Performance is not such that you're going to. However, if you were performing at an outstanding level, in some cases you can go 2 steps or 3 steps. So it's very, very performance based, as opposed to tenure based, or as opposed to I just got another degree, or I just got a. It's all performance based, and it works out pretty good if you've got the money to retain people.
We would definitely like to move in that direction. And for a time, the city did have some performance evaluations, but we really didn't have money tied to it, especially among non-sworn. And so it's kind of dwindled to the point where we only have maybe select divisions who are really still engaging in that performance evaluation process.
And not to belabor it, but haven't I seen somewhere where there are performance, I guess, indicators, okay, by departments, and based upon those performance indicators, the mayor assessed XYZ moving forward?
So our budget division has essentially their key performance indicators, KPIs, or whatever else they might call them now, which looks at some of those measurable statistics by department or division. So they definitely look at some performance measures, but it's definitely much more, at least as I'm familiar with it, more sort of division, department-based goals rather than individual personal goals.
And this is my last question. Then how do we assess performance?
I don't have a great answer for you at this time.
And to me, that's problematic, because, well, we'll talk later. Okay, that's a whole nother subject.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I've been in conversations with, I guess, some of the people with the Firemen's Union. If they were to look at this chart, I believe those numbers are a little bit different. And obviously the facts are what they are. And I know you're dealing with the facts. How do we get to the point to where what they're showing on their grid is what we have here? Because you can't have 2 sets of facts. 9 times 9 is 81, and I don't care who. 12 times 12 is 144. So I don't care whose math you use. Eventually, you come back to the numerical fact. And they're going to be, I think the difference that they're talking about, somehow we have to work towards that. Hopefully, what we see here is being the same that they're showing there. For example, they say when they go into, you get recruited, you go in, you come out, and somehow you get a pay decrease. I kind of found that hard to believe. You go in untrained, you come out with some training, and you get a pay decrease. So that's some of the feedback that we're getting as council people. And quite frankly, I don't really know the facts on that. And instead of having a Chinese wall between 2 bidding factions, one thing I have to give them credit, they've been very respectful when they come to city council to air their concern. They don't come and blast people out. And obviously we say we're going to work to try to help them. But the help has to be based in facts and not this is my terminology, not yours or anybody around the table. Not, I guess, it shouldn't be based in politics. When we looked at the grids there with going back, with comparing us to other cities, one of the things I wanted to kind of vet out, and we could do that later, is, the cities, the mayor alluded to that, the ones closest to us, I guess, in particular, North Charleston, Mount Pleasant, the county. And that's our competition, basically, the immediate competition. We're the largest municipality in the state. We have the largest budget of any city in the state. And, we got San Andrews PSD paying more potentially to their employees than we pay to ours. Now, I understand they got a small number of people and that can potentially skew the situation, but somehow the differences in what they've got and what you're showing, I'd like to know what nuances maybe they're using that comes up with the numbers they come up with, somebody with a high school degree, associate degree, bachelor's degree, and so forth, and what we're showing. Because the way I look at it should be the same. But anyway, have you had a chance to speak with anybody with that union and looked at the numbers there reflecting to others?
Why don't we let the CFO sort of talk about it, because I know little about it in terms of they're starting at 13 something, but in 6 months they go up to blah, blah, blah. Amy can explain it a little better than I can.
Sort of, I can, I think. In essence, what they're saying is right, Councilmember Waring. So when they start as a trainee, they make a certain hourly wage. When they come in as a firefighter, their hourly wage does go down. So in essence, they're right. However, it's based on the number of hours that they're working. So the difference from what we're calculating and what they're calculating is based on the number of hours that they're working. And that's why we have differences. So whereas, yes, their hourly rate goes down, their pay doesn't necessarily go down because they're working more hours as a firefighter than they are as a trainee. Does that make sense?
And some of those hours would be overtime. So
They have their long shifts or short shifts, so they always have built-in overtime, right? In their longer shift, they will have built-in overtime, yes. And then if they work, then they'll have, they could get called in and they would have overtime that way as well. But they have their long shift, which they always have built-in overtime for. So it's just the calculation is very complicated.
So, I mean, does everybody, when I mean everybody, other cities, in particular in our locale, do they calculate it the same way we do? I mean, why is the calculation complicated? I mean, why can't it be simplified?
Well, that's probably what we're probably going to try to work towards. But yes, other cities do not do it necessarily like we do. So it's just, I can't answer the question on why it is the way that it is. It's just happened over time and kind of what we've all inherited here. So maybe this is an opportunity for us to look at all of this differently and come up with something that's less complicated. Ryan can answer a little bit more to that too.
So we definitely did find, as we looked at all the different agencies, that it was a grab bag of numbers of how people estimated their annual compensation. The way that we estimate their annual compensation is we have their schedules essentially mapped out. We know how many hours of overtime they should get. So we think this does give it's a pretty accurate example, assuming you work every shift. So if you show up to every shift that you work, you don't pick up any extra shifts, your numbers should fall pretty close to this. But I will say, because of the vagaries and all the different ways people calculate those annual rates, looking at all the different agencies, for the sake of the survey we did, we looked at hourly rates. We wanted to cut through whatever crazy calculations different agencies were doing, because it was a difference of 600 to 700 hours, depending on who you asked. But for the sake of the survey, we asked for just hourly rate. So when we make that comparison, we're really making that comparison at that apples to apples. What are they actually making per hour comparison, which should, based on our data, kind of get them closer to where they're being. So the number they've been using, you can calculate it differently depending on if you take leave in some weeks, you may not earn overtime that week, and that might affect the number. But for the sake of the estimate we've provided, it's based on assuming you work every shift, here's what it would be. But to make sure we're doing an accurate comparison, we focused on hourly rates.
And does your total factor in overtime?
Yes.
Maybe that's where the kicker is. I mean, why should you have to work?
Firefighter be working?
I believe it's 2,912 on average.
2912?
Correct. I think it's actually, if you're on a shorter cycle, you would work 2,904. If you're on a longer cycle, you'd work 2,928, but it averages to 2,912.
if you could put yourself in a fireman's position, play devil's advocate, knowing what you know, why would they say this is unfair? I just want to hear the other side. They're saying that obviously we need to work to a different system. I understand the system was inherited, but if it ain't working, we definitely got disgruntled firemen. I mean, I can't come and go from my house to my office without seeing signs along around the streets that say support our firefighters. And we all support our firefighters. There's a differential in math. I mean, why do I have to work overtime to make my numbers look like this?
I think that's a fair question.
Yeah.
It's overtime really more in the way that it's kind of the way the laws defined it. We essentially just have them working their regular schedule. It's the 24 on, 48 off. And just due to the way the law works, some amount of those hours might be overtime, some of those hours might not. So it's not that we're necessarily saying you have to work extra. There really is no requirement for you to work beyond what your normal schedule would be to reach these numbers.
But in your answer to the mayor, when the mayor asked about hours, I think on an annual basis, I thought I heard you say something like 28 or 2,900 hours a year. Normal 2,080, 40 hours a week. I understand they got shifts on and shifts off, but 40 hours a week times 52 weeks is 2,080 hours a year. So that's a lot more hours there. 600, 700 more hours. To me, that's overtime.
So that is correct. The firefighters definitely work more hours, but we've essentially tried to maintain some sense of balance, because for the firefighters, when they're on shift, we have a lot of varying expectations for them. And so that's where they're receiving that same hourly rate. Even if they're doing station maintenance, they receive that same hourly rate. If they're lucky enough to get some sleep on shift, they're getting that same hourly rate for literally everything they do in that 24-hour period. Essentially, we do have a lot of expectations for them while they're there as far as training and maintenance and keeping up on all those things, but we're also kind of essentially treating them like they're on call. So they're there kind of at our beck and call for those 24 hours, but they may be doing some other things in those periods as well, and we make no difference between them. So they're still receiving that same hourly rate regardless of what they're actually doing on shift, versus our 40-hour employees where they don't have that kind of flexibility. If you're on shift in your office, you are there to work. And even for the lunch breaks, we don't necessarily cover the whole lunch. Whereas if you're a firefighter, whatever meal breaks you have, we're paying you that whole time because you may get a call at any point. So there are some differences. The firefighters do end up essentially on shift more hours, but due to the nature of their shifts and what they might be doing, you might see some differences in essentially what the work actually being performed is.
Yeah, but I mean, they may be doing that work, but if they get a big fire, they got to jump to the call to action, right?
That's correct.
Anyway, if North Charleston's doing it a lot differently and Mount Pleasant's doing it a lot differently, I don't know why we stay with this old whatever system that we inherited that's creating certainly morale problems at the very least. If this is the time to try to do something about it.
Let's just make sure that they are doing it a different way. I don't think they are, though.
They aren't.
Okay.
No.
There's a couple of agencies that we identified that kind of do something differently. I feel like recently we heard that I think maybe Somerville or some other suburb was looking at maybe switching to a 48 on, 96 off schedule. But otherwise, most agencies are working a 24 on, 48 off. And the way we pay them is based on the FLSA, and we're paying essentially exactly the way the law dictates. So there's really not a lot of flexibility there as to how other agencies are actually handling that.
Mayor?
Could we move on to what our recommendations are regarding all of this?
You have some recommendations on the back, right?
Once we get to the recommendations, we're pretty close to the end.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So for our preliminary recommendations, so we do see some definite room for improvement, particularly among some of our starting pay when we look at the firefighter rank and the police officer rank. So our first recommendation is to restructure the firefighter steps to bring that step one up approximately 10% to be more in line with the rest of the fire department rank comparisons. So when we look at this data, we see, okay, where does the fire department fall on average? How do we bring firefighters at least up that far? So we would recommend restructuring those steps to bring that step one up, increase that starting pay for them as part of the 2023 budget. Additionally, we see a similar issue in the police officer step where their starting pay has begun to drop as other agencies have increased their starting pay to essentially kind of keep pace. So we would also recommend bringing their step one up approximately 10% and restructuring their ranks to manage that as part of the 2023 budget. Our third recommendation would be to add additional pay grades to the non-sworn pay plan. The city's highest pay grade essentially starts at $84,000 a year. When we were surveying some of these higher level positions, we saw them starting at a range anywhere between $92,000 to $105,000. So our highest paid position technically starts anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000 below what other agencies might be paying. By adding additional pay grades, we think we can restructure some of our higher paying positions to essentially move that starting pay up without necessarily making major changes to the positions, but at least giving us more places to start higher.
So we went up to, that's gonna bump everybody.
That would bump everyone up, but it would, but I think even in that case, we'd still recommend at least adding probably another step. Just because, again, as we look at some of these places, when you're starting, a very senior division head position at 106, even if we make
I've never seen anything like this in my life.
Yeah, it definitely hurts our recruitment efforts, as we've seen with recent positions. Just looking at that starting pay, even if we post the range for the position up to a six-figure salary, we have people see that it starts at 84 and basically just say, no, it's not for me.
Right.
You mentioned on the upper end, how are we comparing now on the starting end for non-sworn?
So starting in a non-sworn, we're definitely still low. So we're currently at essentially a minimum wage of around $14 an hour for our 40-hour week employees. Especially in the local region, we've fallen behind a bit. North Charleston is effectively at $16.35. Mount Pleasant is over 15. I forget the exact number. We saw a recent proposal for the school district to reach a $17 an hour minimum wage, and the county, I believe, is proposed to hit $15 an hour as of July of this year. They're basing it closer to the living wage.
Because there is a difference.
There is, and so we did, and that was what we based our cost of living factor on to try to bring us as close to that as we could. Yeah, essentially across our whole plan, there's a couple of positions that we maybe don't need to make major changes to, but in general, essentially every position we surveyed, we found to be lower than what we would find ideal. Some of them get a little closer, but there's definitely still a gap. I mean, there were very few positions, if any, that aligned sort of in the top, even say 25%. And so then beyond those sort of first three recommendations, we'd ask you to consider 4 additional pay adjustments as part of the 2023 budget. As we talked about before, a true cost of living adjustment that is tied to the consumer price index or some other defined measure, something that we would use every year so that we know essentially what that's going to be, essentially ties our plan progression to inflation. We'd also ask you to consider an additional separate pay adjustment to the non-sworn plan, which will have a couple examples. An additional separate pay adjustment to the fire pay plan, in addition to restructuring their entry-level steps. And it's the same thing for the police pay plan. Frankly, we believe there's room for improvement kind of across the board.
And how are the chiefs? Are the chiefs aware of these recommendations? Did they help work on these recommendations? Would it get them closer to where they want to be?
I believe they're both aware of the survey that we were doing. We haven't had as much a chance to talk in a lot of detail. To be frank, we really kind of finished putting the recommendations together in about the last week. So we haven't had as much time to sort of discuss with them as we maybe would have liked. But again, these are very preliminary recommendations. We're going to spend some more time sort of refining exactly what these are going to look like. But again, this was a major survey that we knew we wanted to do this year, no matter what, based on kind of what happened last year. And we've been kind of working on it for about 4 months.
Councilman Gregg, and then Councilmember.
So for the additional pay adjustments, number one, are you proposing that as an annual, like every year doing that?
Correct. Yeah, our recommendation would be an every year, and essentially an inflationary rise to keep the plan at pace.
So my suggestion here, I mean, no company I've ever worked for has ever done a cost of living adjustment based on CPI. It's always based on what the competitors are doing in the market. So my suggestion here would be that this should be benchmarked against what other governments are doing, how other governments are paying their employees instead of tying it to CPI. Because that could, I mean, we're not going to drop their pay when CPI goes down, which hopefully it will next year. So crossing our fingers. So then these 2, 3, and 4 would be in addition to that number 1.
Correct.
Okay.
And yeah, and the cost of living, CPI was just one of our leading examples. We think the bigger thing would be having a defined measure. So if we were to say, you know, we're going to do a regular survey and that's the benchmark we use.
I think that should be what we use as a regular survey of other municipal governments and how they're increasing pay.
Thank you. So I appreciate you earlier. In one of the earlier slides, the amount of employees who choose to live in the city and providing that, because I know that's something I'd asked for. And so I appreciate that. But I don't see in the recommendations that we would provide a differential to those employees living in the city or to add it as an incentive. So as an example, if you currently live in Ladson, but the city provided a 5% or whatever number we come up with, pay differential if you choose to live in the city because you're paying property taxes. You know, you're a contributing member on the tax side, but there's the opportunity benefits that happen as well, right? Because you're going to volunteer in the community, be a little league coach, you know, maybe worship at various places of worship in the city and be a part of the fabric of the community instead of thinking of us just as an employer where you commute into Charleston and then leave. You would be able to stay. So is that something we could consider where we would provide a differential if the employee actually lived in the city and is a part of the civic life of the city?
I can't say I'm terribly aware of any such thing. I will say my sort of immediate thought would be, especially as we've seen the cost of living in the city, if we have staff who feel they can't live in the city, they're going to essentially feel like we're also punishing them by paying them less for not being able to do so. So I would be a little, I think, cautious if we were to explore that route, just because it sort of creates two distinct camps of people, which I think, especially given some of our current circumstances, as much as we can kind of keep everybody sort of together as one group, I think the better off we'd be. But it's something we could potentially look into.
Well, because my concern is that when employees and the police and fire come to us and they talk about wanting to live in the city, that's the incentive to provide, is that if you do want to truly live in the city, we can provide that incentive to you, right? Like we can create that, because otherwise we can across the board raise pay, but that's not going to necessarily convince someone to come to the city. But that's the argument that's being put forth to us on council, is that they would like to live in the city, but they're not getting paid enough to do so.
I mean, the city already has down payment assistance programs available, which to me is an incentive. If someone wants to live in the city, we'll help you buy a house. So there are, I mean, it's not articulated quite that way, but to me, there are some incentives out there. And then there are also some federal incentives out there too, for people to be able to participate in buying houses, et cetera, in the cities that they live in.
Right.
But it sounds like you're talking about a residency preference.
Right. But it's philosophical for me in that if you're making the argument, that you aren't getting paid enough to live in the city, then we can give you a, essentially a 5 to 7, whatever it is, % step increase to live in the city. Right? Like, I mean, am I making sense?
Yeah, you make sense.
Okay. Because I will say the city of Hartford in Connecticut does provide that.
You go ahead.
So Not in South Carolina, but there are municipalities that do provide that for employees. It's not like I've just created it out of the blue.
So one of our homework assignments, I think, was to look at what we are offering employees right now. So let's come back with that maybe. And then I think we can talk about all of that for sure, but getting us kind of where we need to be is probably should be our first focus, because this is what we need to do is going to take a couple of years for us to really kind of put together and get a good plan in place. So I would just maybe say that and let us come back with some of the incentives that we're providing or that we know we can provide right now, and then move forward with.
So this
that.
is more informational at this point?
Yeah, these are just,
Okay.
things that we kind of see we need to do,
Okay.
very, very preliminary. Obviously, there will be a lot more discussion about this, and also just, Brian has a couple more slides, yes?
Great.
Are they the scary ones?
Well,
And they're-
Mr. Chairman,
They're terrifying slides.
Councilmember Waring and
yeah,
then
yeah,
Mayor.
just to kind of piggyback on Councilman Brady, I actually, any employees that we have in that live in the PSD that can annex to the city, they may not be aware that they immediately going to save money on their property taxes, immediately will save money on their water and sewer bills. A lot of people just don't know that. Most people, they save enough to take a cruise every year when they annex from St. Andrews PSD to the city. So I don't know how we got a new annexation coordinator. It'd be good if that maybe can be put in as a did you know type thing in I guess out to our employees. I'm just telling you, if somebody bought a house in the PSD, it used to be taxes were lower in the PSD, but that hadn't changed since we had local option sales tax. We've had that, 15, almost 20 years. So anyway, that's a little incentive that did you know, if they knew, they would take advantage of. The second thing is, in Public Works Department, we have, I think, 7 ditch cleaning crews budgeted. But we have 3 of them staffed. And the fact is, you can't hire people at $14 an hour with a pick and axe to go in and clean up these ditches. So we have budgeted positions that don't get filled. How can we, I don't know, work the pay grade to the point to where to give Matt Fountain, for example, flexibility to take those unfunded employees that we can't, budgets amounts that we can't hire somebody at $14 an hour, take some of those dollars to increase so we can hire and get our ditch cleaning crews back up to full force again, instead of being at 50% or less than 50% of capacity.
So I think part of the issue with that is that we have a lot of very similar positions across the city. So when you look at stormwaters, their ditch crews are essentially what we call kind of a construction worker. We also have those in public service. And so the problem we run into is, I think if we were to look at potentially maybe realigning positions in a way to increase the pay, we would really need to do it across the board. Otherwise, we'd be potentially running into an issue where, okay, well, stormwater has found a way to get the money, so they're going to pay more money, but public service doesn't have the flexibility. So now their construction workers who are doing very similar work are getting paid less, and sort of creating our own internal problem. I think we would need to look at potentially closing positions on really a global scale, and how do we convert that into sort of raising that minimum for everyone, because we have so much overlap amongst so many of our departments that we can't really fix the problem in any one department.
Well, let me say this: letting the position.
Hold on. Is this one second?
Okay.
So we're staying in order. Is this a reclassification issue then? Reclassifying some of those jobs so that those jobs will be able to get the kind of funding in order for us to be able to do what we need to do?
I don't believe so. And then especially when we look at the way we've structured our pay plan, the issue we run into is one we've talked before about pay compression. And what we have is we have construction workers kind of towards the bottom, but then one grade above them is maybe the lead construction workers, and maybe one grade above them is the crew leader. A grade or two above that is your equipment operators. And so there's no real easy way to reclassify any one position without it potentially interfering with another. So if we raise,
have we ever, and I'll come to you, Councilman Weir, have we ever done a total look at reclassifying all of our jobs?
so that is part of what we've looked at in this case. And
Okay.
part of it is over the last few years, we did work to raise the minimum wage, which we were pretty successful at. We used to be substantially lower. But part of the way we did that was we essentially kind of compressed some of those bottom grades. At one point, on average, our pay grades were approximately 10% apart. So there was about a 10% difference from one pay grade to the next. Now, among our bottom grades, it's about 6 or 7%. So it's so much closer together that there's not as much wiggle room. And essentially, I think we've kind of squeezed as much room out of that as we can. And we're kind of at the point now where if we're going to make a change to a class of positions, it's going to impact another class, which is going to impact another class. And ultimately, we kind of have to find a way to flow that through the whole plan. Otherwise, we're going to run into a situation where we've almost pitted department against department.
That's why you have to do total reclassification study now.
So Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Ryan for his level of research and all this.
Is he finished?
It's as
Oh, he's not.
comprehensive. I apologize. I have to go in a few minutes and wanted to make a statement. Oh, finish the last slide.
Yeah, we'll knock out the last one. So based on our salary survey, we have some preliminary estimates. We're essentially looking at what would it take for us to get in the top 1%, which would put us essentially at where we looked at sort of like Hilton Head as being very high, versus what it would take for us to get in the top 10%, which puts us kind of closer to sort of Durham, Mount Pleasant, maybe St. Andrews non-sworn positions, versus getting into the top 25%, which gets us a little closer to where sort of Greenville and Savannah are. To get in the top 1%, we'd be looking at a substantial increase. This is an estimate for essentially to get there right now, 1 year. If we were to get there for January 1, 2023, we would need to make a non-sworn adjustment of about 45%, sworn adjustments of 20 to 30, and it would be about $40 million. That's the top 1%, which we would like, but is a stretch. Top 10%, non-sworn would take about 37%, sworn would be somewhere between 15 and 25. The estimated cost would be about $31 million. To get us in the top 25%, which would put us closer to sort of Greenville and Savannah, our non-sworn adjustment would need to be about 22%. Sworn adjustments anywhere between 5 and 15, and the estimated cost would be $17 million. So to get in the top 25% of those we've surveyed, which again kind of puts us in the realm of where some of our competitors are, where we look at sort of Mount Pleasant and North Charleston, kind of edging up towards that top 25%, just to catch up to them today would cost $17 million. That's my last slide.
Does this take into account vacancies and then filling all the vacancies that we currently have?
Yeah, so this is a total cost. So this assumes that we make no other changes. We just take all the positions we have now and get them to where we want them to be.
Okay, but this assumes we're at 100% staffing across all departments?
Correct. So
Okay.
this is a max. This is essentially a maximum estimate.
Okay,
The numbers aren't exactly right. We rounded them off a little bit, but this would be sort of a top level cost.
okay, thank you.
Did you take into account the amount of dollars that you'd be saving in the overtime that you're paying right now when you did this?
No, so this just assumes that sort of baseline level of we reach our staffing in, what would that cost? So the actual cost would be lower. It's a little harder for us to estimate exactly what that might look like though.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, given the staffing levels that we are operating under now, okay, and we're meeting all of our goals for the most part, has anybody talked about a reduction in force potentially? I mean, we're at 17,000, 1,700, Mayor, employees?
Right.
Okay, and if we have this level of vacancy across the board, and we're still doing what we're supposed to be doing, doesn't that raise some other questions?
I think it would. That said, I do think there's a lot of departments who maybe feel like they're not quite doing everything that they would necessarily like to do. I think there's definitely some things we would like to move more in the direction of that we haven't been able to as of yet. But that is kind of one of the questions, is especially looking at our staffing rate and given the position that we're in, that may be something we need to consider, is longer term to make this work. What do we need to do?
Right, I'm just throwing this stuff out for consideration.
So
Yes, CFO.
Obviously, we're going to be talking about a lot of different things, right? But I want to remind you too, with our vacancy savings, how we budget for
Yes.
that. So taking positions away might not help as much as we think it would, because we're already accounting for that in our savings number. So we just need to look at everything.
Clearly understand. Clearly, just throwing things out there. Mr. Mayor.
So if I may, and would you go back, Ryan, to the recommendations page? And I probably don't have to say this, but I'm going to, historically, those working for government have an aspect of public service to their careers and to their employment that the private sector doesn't have. And also historically, the private sector pays more. Of course, all our comparisons were really with other governments.
That's correct.
And not with the private sector. I understand that. And I got to tell you, the employees of the city of Charleston, it's an honor to work with them, both sworn and non-sworn. I believe they do a remarkable job. And given that our vacancies are there, they've been pulling extra weight. And then the job market in the last year has just kind of turned upside down as a result of COVID. So you basically see, which I believe in, the 4 recommendations. We need a pay adjustment for every employee of the city of Charleston. We tried to do that last year with our cost of living increase was much more than it had been for a while, but just the combination of the labor market and everything else, I mean, we're still behind where we should be. It's amazing to me that 7 years ago, when I walked in the door and we were paying some people $8.50 an hour, and we were trying to get to 15. We're still not quite there yet. We got put back a year or two because of the revenue shortfalls from COVID. But then we were trying to catch back up last year, and we're still behind. I mean, because the private sector has really jumped ahead of us, and even some of our competition, if you will, has. And just for the first time, I think I had an insight with the vacancy rates of what's going on in the labor market right now. I mean, our sworn positions, police and fire, they could leave their profession and go do something else, but for the most part, they're likely to remain a firefighter or police officer, so they can stay with us or they can go work for Mount Pleasant or move somewhere else. Now, a truck driver who's driving, a garbage truck or a trash truck, I mean, he can go to work for some other trucking company or many other private sector options. So with what's happened in the labor market, it kind of makes sense to me right now that we're seeing this higher turnover with our non-sworn positions, because they really have a lot of options right now to make more money, right? So the bottom line is to consider the 4 additional pay adjustments. It's all the city employees. And you saw the comparison, not to CPI, but to our competition. Even to get in the top 25% would cost us $17 million a year. So that's a big nut for us to be thinking about for next year. I did want to ask Amy if add to our homework list. I know you got a long one assignment, just to see on those first two recommendations to restructure step one, what it would cost for the balance of this year from July 1 to December 31st, if that can be figured, because it seems that starting adjustment there on the firefighter step one is something that's just glaring in our face, something we know we need to do. And I'd say the same about step one on the police side as well. I don't know how big of a budget item that is, and when we get our audit back, whether we got a few extra bucks for the balance of the year. But I would like to at least take a look and see if that's a bite that we could take this year rather than waiting till next year. And then we got to look at the whole plan. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, on that, I agree with everything the mayor said on that. I mean, we gotta find a way to pay more. When it comes to that, those options, 1, 2, 3, and 4, was retirement figured in that as well?
In what way?
Excuse me, if we had the 17% pay raise or whatever it is to bring us up in the 25 percentile, in that number was contributions to the retirement plan and fringe included in that?
Yes. So that total cost includes all fringe costs. So that's every bit of retirement increase, tax increase, every other possible cost.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, one last thing. Have we ever thought about, in addition to bringing the pay up, somehow incorporating a bonus program?
So we do have a sign-on bonus program that we've used for some positions, particularly hard to fill positions. Some of our CDL drivers in particular, we've used a kind of sign-on bonus to bring people in the door. But honestly, we don't have great data on it, but anecdotally, we haven't seen that necessarily bring in as many people through the door as we would like. They tend to seem to focus more on what that hourly rate's actually going to be versus a bonus we might have to bring them in.
What I really was thinking about is bonuses for retention, in particular for management team, because frankly, right now we're in a vulnerable position, and we got some management department heads that if the private sector were to snatch them away from us, we'd be hurt. So I just wonder whether some sort of bonus program, if we can begin to work on that as well as bring compensation up.
So, Councilmember Waring, we do have bonuses, like we can do bonuses. We don't have an official program for it, but we do offer, supervisors can ask for bonuses for their employees. There's just not a formal program for it, but we can look at that too.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so quick question on the bullets here. So bringing up the step one on both police and fire. I mean, I'm just looking at the charts back here. So, and you're gonna have to adjust all the steps. It's not just step one, because if you do that, you're gonna bring step one up. I mean, they'll get paid more than step two. Same for the police.
And luckily on the fire side, we have a little bit of flexibility because the increase from step one to step two is already a little over 10%.
Okay.
That's where our recommendation is really, we would need to restructure that whole rank. Essentially, we would need to find a way to sort of restructure it so that it still balances out. On the fire side, since they have such a high growth potential and they move so fast, we think that gives us some options to potentially kind of stretch things out a little bit, essentially front load more of that growth.
Okay.
That we could find a way to build in more money on the front end. Maybe their progression slows a little to match more closely like what police's growth looks like.
Okay.
And we can kind of try to control a little bit of the cost that way.
Got it.
But yeah, we would need to restructure.
It's all the steps, not just the
Correct.
first step.
Yeah.
All right. Got it. Thank you.
We have a member with us, budget ad hoc, and we'll all be talking.
Turn on your mic, Mr. Chairman.
There's one other item on the agenda, preliminary discussion of medical plans.
When we meet, when do we meet again?
And right now it's in another month, but we can have meetings whenever we want. Do you want to table this one?
Yeah, can we table that and maybe have a
Second.
meeting?
Because that one's gonna be a lot of discussion, I'm sure.
Right.
Okay, then seconded that we table preliminary discussion on medical plans. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Do I hear a motion?
Move to adjourn.
Thank you.